Hello, and thank you for joining me today on the Political Conversationalist. My name is Ben Phipps. Today we're still talking about systems of government, but we're talking about one that's a little more relevant to today's world than last time's video. Talking about socialism. Socialism is a buzzword in American politics right now. People are arguing for it and arguing against it. But I'm going to give you a clear definition of what it is and a good example, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how it works. So socialism is any system of government in which the government controls the means of production, owns and controls the means of production. So in a true socialist country, every single business in that country would be owned by the government. That's a little scary in and of itself, but that's what socialism truly is. Another important thing socialism is if you remember when we talked about communism, we talked about how communism actually does away with the government, does away with currency, and it's just too inefficient for a large scale. Well, socialism is that step that is supposed to go capitalism, then socialism, then communism in Marxist ideology. And like we discussed in the communism video, everybody's stuck in socialism or some form thereof. There are very few completely socialist states in the world, and I could only really find one that's very close to it that I could give a good example for today. Another thing is socialism is not really good or bad, honestly, because it's an incomplete system of government. It's actually more of a system of economy. It tells you how businesses work. Businesses are owned and controlled by the government, but it doesn't tell you how the government works. So theoretically, you could have a democratic republic socialist state where you voted on who was the government and then the government controlled everything. Never seen it happen, doubt it ever will happen, but it's theoretically possible. So the example we're going to talk about today is one involving beards, cigars, AK-47s, and a fierce hatred of America. I'm talking about Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba from Batista in 1959, and he ruled there until his death, which I believe was 2008. He was a really good guerrilla warfighter and surprisingly not that bad of a diplomat, and was kind of seen as the leader of the third world or the developing world for a very long time. There's actually a book about him written by one of his bodyguards. The Double Life of Fidel Castro really talks about how in-depth and how much of a big impact he had. But just like with Nelson Mandela, we're going to do a separate video on him, and I'm going to pull from that book. But if you are curious about Fidel Castro and what he was like on a day-to-day basis, be sure to pick that up. It's a really good book. Anyway, so in Cuba, he set up a socialist government. Now, they called it communist, not communist. Set up a socialist government. 75% of the people, and these are recent statistics, the best I could find, 75% of people in Cuba work directly for the government or a government-owned business, because almost all businesses in Cuba are controlled by the government, and that's what makes it socialist. In recent years, though, the private sector has been expanding because it's honestly just easier that way. But all the media corporations, the news outlets and all those things are controlled directly by the government. The internet is tightly controlled by the government. I remember reading about something I believe they called the package, which was a USB flash drive which would have international news and things on it that people could buy monthly. So it would kind of be like a little newspaper on a flash drive because access to the internet is so tightly regulated. They pay about a 10 to 50% tax, and the ones that work directly for the government, their salaries are rationed. All that money is put into social programs such as healthcare, infrastructure, utilities, education, things like that. But it's really not that great of a place to live. A lot of them come up to America. In fact, there's a law on the books in America that if anyone from Cuba makes it to America, they will be granted asylum because it's that bad to live there. And that's going to be telling when we discuss more about socialism later in the video. But it's a pretty bad place to live. The government is very underhanded, very violent, and they control everything, so you can't get away from them. I tried to find a good example of socialism. I really did. I looked into all the countries you hear of being socialist. I looked into the Scandinavian countries, and they're not socialist. The Scandinavian countries are democratic republics with extremely high taxes, and they use those taxes to push social programs. But social programs aren't socialist. Social programs are like welfare and Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. Those are social programs. But in the Scandinavian countries, the taxes can be up to 60%, the federal tax, and that will pay for all those things. So you kind of have a trade-off of your healthcare and your education is already paid for, but you've been paying for it your whole life, and if you never use it, you've been paying for everyone else's. Where people get confused on that is some Scandinavian countries, and I look specifically at Norway for these examples, own parts or whole businesses. Mainly infrastructure companies. So firstly, in Norway, they don't completely own the companies. They'll own a large share of the stock in the company. The company itself is also free to operate. The government doesn't tell the company what to do. And thirdly, they are largely, like I said, infrastructure companies like utility companies or road companies, things like that, that in some cases in America are just directly handled by some kind of government agency. In fact, one of the Scandinavian countries you hear so much about being socialist, in Denmark, one of their high-ranking diplomats specifically said, "We're not socialists." So maybe it's time to admit it. Socialism looks really good on paper, and it seems as if it all depends on who you have in charge. But the more power a small group of people is given, the worse it tends to turn out. So socialism looks good on paper, but it's not a good idea. I can't find any good examples of any socialist state in which the quality of life was good for people. I can't find any example of a socialist state in which people have true freedom of speech. I can't find any example of a socialist state in which people can truly elect their leadership. So socialism looks good in a vacuum, but in reality, socialism is a better word for a dictatorship. Anyway, I hope you learned something today. Let me know down in the comments if I got anything wrong or got anything right, or if you agree or disagree. Hit like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.